Rachel, and I'm here to do a belated fantasy sampler reading project. I went ahead and dubbed last month Fantasy February because I read this entire series, the God Surf series, epic theological fantasy by N.S. Dulcart. And I also have this free sampler from Del Rey Books. I've had it ever since last summer when I picked it up from San Diego Comic-Con. And I wanted to get around, finally, to reading these excerpts from novels that came out last year. I'm particularly interested in this collection because this is adult science fiction and fantasy, and I want to start inching a bit more into the adult side of things. I have a special place in my heart for YA epic fantasy, but there's always room to grow. So this sampler has 6 fantasy offerings in the broad categories of fairy tales turned upside down and myths, monsters, and magic. So I went ahead and started this project by reading the first 2 chapters of Kill the Farm Boy by Delilah S. Dawson and Kevin Hearn. My first immediate reaction to this title is that it's some sort of satire of Star Wars. I guess I just have Farm Boy associated way too much with Luke Skywalker. But no, this is a epic fantasy pastiche, but it's definitely a satire of it. The first chapter is basically a quick prologue about a sleeping maiden. And then in the second chapter, we immediately get into introducing the chosen one, called Worstly, who is differentiated by his favored dead older brother, Bestly. And Worstly is just trudging around his farm doing farm work when a bedraggled pixie, with frayed clothing and one sock and a fungal smell, comes up to him and says that he is indeed the chosen one and has a destiny. And then she goes ahead and she proves her power by magicking his goat, Gus, to be able to speak. And Gus turns out to have a sarcastic and elitist side. It is actually Gustav. And then from there, the pixie says, well, she really has no idea what he's supposed to do, but there's a castle and maybe things could happen there, and it's maybe the promise of a maiden or whatever. And from there, they freak out his parents because of the talking goat, and the parents kick them out and they're on their way. So this is a really humorous story, but I admit humor isn't really my genre. I just don't know if I could keep my interest going on these merits alone, but I'm glad I got to step my toe into this. I'll see how I do with the next one. Okay, I'm back and I'm here to talk about the second fantasy sampler in this collection. This is The World of Lore, Monstrous Creatures by Erin Moncay. This is urban fantasy, and it's told in an interesting style, these first few chapters. We basically have a chronicler from afar, who's, so far we don't really know his personal connection to the story at all. And he is telling this story, which takes part in Florida, and the first chapter is about some construction workers finding the remains of a 7,000-year-old girl, and the chronicler is saying, oh, and do you see how even for thousands of years girls and, well, children were buried with toys, saying that toys are important to children, and here's some examples of how they changed during the Enlightenment. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. I'm interested in where we're going here. But then it takes a hard left or whatever into a Chucky-like story. And it's like, by the way, there are evil possessed dolls. And then we go to staying again in Florida. We're in the 19th century, and there's this well-to-do family, the Ottos, and their maid buys their child Jean a doll that he names Robert. And then, there's all of these scary instances of Jean and Robert having conversations behind closed doors where it seems like there's a second voice in the room, or they're screaming and Robert cowering and the doll glaring at him, and things get darker from there. When they put Robert in the attic, there's sounds of movement, and the relative who suggested putting him in the attic ends up dead. And then the chronicler takes a philosophical tone again and says, you know, you think of the Salem witch trials where people were stripped of their humanity because they were different. And I'm like, yeah, that is really interesting. And then he goes into, but dolls are like inhumane creatures who are given humanity. Perhaps that's what happened. And I'm like, what? I don't know. I think this is just me in the horror genre. It freaks me out too much. I'd rather hear a different type of story about the use of toys in children for thousands of years, or the dehumanization of people during the Salem witch trials. I mean, on its surface, neither of those are urban fantasy horror the way that evil Chucky-like dolls are, but that would be where I would be more interested in going. But it certainly is a page-turner, so actually by the end of the sampler I was expecting it to go on, and it didn't, so he definitely did something right here. Let's hope the next author does too. Okay, I'm back, having just read Unbury, Carroll by Josh Malerman. This is another urban fantasy horror genre thing. Our protagonist is a woman named Carroll with this condition that she never dies, but she falls into comas and goes to a place called Howltown. And the novel opens when she's at the funeral of a friend who she had told, and now he's dead himself. And she has this premonition of some sort that she would fall into a coma, and during that time her husband Dwight, who is the only other person who knows about her condition, would die. So she has to find someone else to tell. And she's about to tell the maid when this when the condition falls on her, and literally that's what it is. Howltown is personified by her falling, and that's the major part of it. But I don't know, I didn't like this one as much. There isn't a lot of world building, at least to start with, so it was a bit confusing to get into it. A lot of dialogue and strangeness. Also, almost immediately, we realized that someone else from her past might still be alive and know the story of her condition. So there's that, which I guess is a good thing, because when she goes to Howltown, she's still aware of reality around her, even though she's in a coma. And it becomes apparent that her husband, who was himself personified earlier by her friends and her friend who knew her condition's insistence that her husband only married her for her money, her husband Dwight is now telling the maid she's actually dead. And when he's alone with Carol's body, he basically says, well, I can't live in your shadow, so don't wake up. And it seems like he's leaving her to go to the funeral home. So that part is kind of scary, very, that's the horror part. And I guess by that part it's a little bit compelling, like what's going to happen, anyone going to save her? But I guess I'm not very moved, it's definitely more horror than fantasy, because this whole Howltown thing is only dramatized so far by the sound of her falling, not the sound, but the narrative saying she's falling, while the crux of the plot and the story is still just what's going on in the real world. So that almost seems like realist fiction. I mean, at least I think that there's been some cases of people in comas who have been aware of the real world around them and just been unable to, interact with it. So far in terms of fantasy, there's not a whole lot here. And this horror premise just, I don't think is jiving with me long term, so I would not continue with this story. I hope for better luck with the next one. And I'm back to talk about Dragon's Code by Gigi McCaffrey. This is a installment of the Pern novels that was started by Gigi's mother, Anne McCaffrey. They are, I guess, technically sword and sorcery novels, not epic fantasy. I've been thinking about a recent tag Steve Donahue made. This is definitely more my genre in either case, this epic fantasy world. Or that being said, I found it kind of difficult to get into this one, and I think it's partially because it's one book in a large series with a lot of backstory. And also, I think, as much as I love these books with dragons and magic and far-off worlds, it actually takes me a little while to understand all of the pieces. And so I sort of just coast along for the first few chapters and then pick up the plot and the world building as the story goes along, and then sort of retro back to the beginning. So that's kind of where I am, because I only read one chapter in this, and what I can say is that we are going on this mission with dragons and people, from one cultural area to another. We have a protagonist and an antagonist, and the protagonist is spying on antagonist, talking about a political something or other, and then he sends one of his dragons to sort of follow the antagonist to see where he's going, and at the end of the chapter he's like, oh, this sounds like trouble, we gotta go follow him. And another one of his dragons is named Stupid. Anyway, I mean, I think if I had the book, I'd maybe be intrigued enough to continue and learn more about it as I go. But then again, with such a large series like the Pern novels, I don't know, it doesn't seem necessarily a friendly place to start smack dab in the middle like this. So it also could be that I'm too tired and that I'm read this and I'm making this video too late at night. So I might not be at my best, but I will be back soon to talk about the next installment in this. Hello, it's a new day, but I'm back here to talk about the section that intrigued me the most in this collection. It is Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. This is a book that I actually am intending and have been intending to read this year as part of my Sci-Fi September TBR. Yep, I'm pretty well planned in advance. This is a Jewish fairy tale retelling of Rumpelstiltskin, so it was definitely on my radar. These first two chapters, I think they had a slow start. I think that's pretty normal, par for the course, it seems, for these selections. The first chapter introduces us to our main character, Miriam, who takes over her father's money-lending business, basically, because he wasn't actually making a profit out of it. He was letting the people who were his customers sort of run roughshod over him and not pay him back as per the parameters of the business. And so she sort of hardened her heart to these people and demanded her due, her family's due. And then in the second chapter, it changed POVs, and I'm not sure I was expecting that, even though I've listened to a lot of reviews or seen a lot of reviews of this book. I don't know. But we go to the daughter of one of the people who owes Miriam's family money, and she also seems to come from pretty dire circumstances. But these are both very set-up chapters. I believe plot will bloom a bit later, but I mean, I'm biased. I know I'm going to continue with this anyway. It does seem relatively slow, but I think, again, I talked about this earlier, that sometimes I'm okay with not being entirely on the same page with fantasy for a little bit and just letting my mind catch up a little bit later in the story when more of the ground rules are set up. So I am still very much on board. And now I'm going to go ahead and read the last selection, the last fantasy selection anyway, in this sampler. So I'll be back. Okay, I'm back for the final time to talk about the last fantasy installment in this sampler. This is Daughters of the Storm by Kim Wilkins. This is another epic fantasy. We start with a prologue with an old king, it seems, being sick, and his second wife being unsure of who to contact. She's a little bit on the odds, it seems, with her stepdaughters, particularly the eldest, Bluebell, who, despite her name, seems to be kind of a warmonger, maybe. It's early goings. I just read a prologue and chapter 1, but the stepmother calls for her son instead. And in the second chapter, we go to Bluebell's POV, where she's in the midst of battle, but then she hears from a friend that her father is sick, and goes to rouse her sisters, and who are in different places, and then to go to see her father herself. So there is certainly a hint of family drama to come, which always gets me. I always love that. There's some medieval-esque, it seems, scene setting. Not a lot of magic or fantasy elements as of yet, but still early going, and I assume that more will come. And this medieval-esque family drama setting, it could be enough for me. It's certainly enough to intrigue me or pique my interest. That being said, Out of all 6 of these offerings, I mean, I think these last 2 that I just read today are the ones that interest me the most, but I'm pretty sure I'm only going to end up reading Spinning Silver in full. There's just too much to read. But I am happy to give these titles a chance and to see what's up and coming in the world of fantasy, in the genre of fantasy. And anyway, I will be back to this sampler collection soon, I believe in May, to review the 7, I believe, samplers in this part of the book, the Star Wars section. Hopefully I will get them up a bit earlier in May than I did for this fantasy section in February, considering it's not February anymore. So that about covers it for me. This endeavor of reading these samplers is kind of interesting, although to an extent it feels like a waste of time because I just am not peaked enough to expand my TBR that much. So like as I said, I read 6 chapters or 6 starts of books really, and then ultimately only decided to continue with the one I was going to continue with anyway. But that's how it goes, and I guess I'm repeating myself to say that I still like having some knowledge of what's out there in the field. So I'm glad at least also to have justified all of the stuff that I dragged home from Comic-Con, because I promised myself that I would do something with BookTube to justify, you know, picking up all these free samplers. So I'm nearing the end here. I have the Star Wars samplers that I want to read in May, and then I would love to read the sci-fi samplers, which are also in this part of the book. I would love to read those in September for Sci-Fi September, so we'll see how I do. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.